Hi, guys. This is Josh Scherrer back to answer your questions about the book 2020. And today we are going to look at the month of December, that chapter. So let's get started. Giselle asks, what were the roamers, or this chapter they mentioned that they are called phantoms in the north, infected with, and why are they going north instead of south? So these roamers, we find out and a little bit later in the chapter that they are infected with the TBR parasite, this protozoa, and it is some sort of disease that has been around for a while in Africa. It causes what is known as sleeping sickness. I mentioned this in an earlier video towards the beginning. But we don't really know why they are going north instead of south. We know that they are still probably searching for food. Um, we don't really know, and it's not ever really explained fully, why they might be headed north. However, if Marlin is headed north because he knows that there are uh, possibly doctors there that are trying to discover a cure. Maybe that pack mentality of the roamers, if some of them are still not quite infected enough to lose total consciousness, if they had heard that information before and they start going north in search of a doctor in their, altered animalistic state, you know, they still might be influencing, indirectly or not even on purpose, but influencing other roamers to follow them. And maybe they are actually, in a way, looking for a cure. We don't know. That is a possibility. And, it's one of the mysteries I kind of left in the book. All right. Carla asked, how did Marlon get sick? So if you remember, there's an attack on the camp. He gets attacked. And after he gets attacked, he manages to get onto a raft and gets out to the middle of the lake. And that more or less saves his life because the roamers do not go after him or the others that are on the raft. And then he's rescued from there. But he gets sick because he actually gets infected, like his dad got infected and Tony got infected. It just so happens that he's rescued by the reconnaissance team, the scout team of Dr. Staten and the hospital before he dies. All right. Brandon asked, who is Jenny? I would like to know her background. So Jenny, we don't know a whole lot about her other than she used to be a secretary in an accountant's office in the town close to Cedar Lake. She's obviously very mechanically talented. It's not specifically said, but she mentions that she found the truck she drives out in the field, so she must have been able to repair it and get it running again. She seems fairly decent in terms of her own morality. She seems to be quote unquote normal compared to the rest of Cedar Lake, and really she serves as this stepping stone for Marlin emotionally. Marlin is distraught because his wife is dead. He's distraught because his parents are dead. He's distraught because he may never see his children again. He doesn't know exactly where they're at, but she offers a little bit of hope. And, so it's that hope that he finds comforting, I think, most of all. Kayla asks, what has made the government so corrupt? So it's not necessarily a question of corruption, and I assume you're talking about how they're trying to uh, maneuver these survivors and take them for study and all those things. Without being too much of a conspiracy theorist, leadership is not guaranteed, right? And we've seen in various degrees, and everybody, because we're living in the moment, has a different opinion about this, but we've seen different degrees of effective leadership at the federal, state, and local levels across the United States with our own pandemic. And, our own pandemic is not as extreme as what's in the book. thankfully. There's not roamers going around trying to eat people. There's not this complete breakdown of civilization. But even in our own small way, we've seen on the news, some people believe that our current situation, they believe coronavirus isn't that serious. They shouldn't be forced to wear a mask. So people don't wear a mask in public because, that they believe is against their right. Whatever right they're talking about, I'm not really sure, but it's against their right. Uh, we've seen people protesting, protesting because they don't want to be told to stay at home. We've been seeing protests because they want to go back to work, and the government's basically said it's not safe to have all these people working because that's how the disease spreads, which it does. The coronavirus is just another version of a cold or something that we've had around for a long, long time. And so this particular coronavirus, COVID-19, it is acting very similarly to all the other diseases that we've had. It's just that typically, if you get a cold or even the flu, you are sick for a few days, but it's never enough that you're like, oh, I shouldn't be spreading this to other people, right? It's just an accepted fact. It's a risk that you take that every year you'll probably get a cold, right? Because you might touch a surface, and then when you touch the surface, you don't wash your hands, and then you pick up a grape and you eat the grape, and the virus is on that grape, and it gets into your system, and you get a cold, right? It's the same thing with the coronavirus, but the coronavirus, because its complications are so much more drastic, it seems, in the early data that these steps have been taken by the government. But, it's not been consistent in terms of its response. Kentucky, where I live, is very strict in its response. We are still under a stay-at-home order as of the time of this video, whereas Indiana is lifting some of its stay-at-home orders and increasing the number of people that can gather at any given point. And by the end of May, most businesses in Indiana will be open. In Kentucky, it might not be until the end of June that a lot of businesses are fully open. And so, just from one state to the next, we border each other, but very different responses to how we are going to handle this outbreak. And then the federal government has its own version of how it's going to respond. And then the leadership between the president and Congress are so drastically different that we get these different messages. So it's not, to get back to your question, it's not necessarily about the corruption, right? It's about how the government is responding. And that response for most people would seem very corrupt, but for others, it seems logical. Let's round up everybody, see if they're infected or not. If they are infected, there's no treatment, so let's put them out of their misery. Let's kill them. It's very drastic, but it's logical in a way. But then people protest against being rounded up, just like people are protesting against staying at home. And so then the government steps in and says, okay, we're going to stop these protests. And so then there's bloodshed. Maybe those protesters were armed, like we've seen in Michigan today. Protesters are armed. In Chicago, protesters have weapons. And so it only takes one or two bad people, bad decisions even, for it to turn violent. And so in the book, even though it's not really specifically written by Marlin, a couple bad decisions leads to violence, and then there's a complete lockdown, and the government kind of being corrupt. And then the other side of that, to fully answer your question, I know it's been a very detailed explanation, but as we'll see as we go through the rest of the book, the government is not completely innocent in its involvement with TBR, right? And I've said from the beginning, TBR had to come from somewhere. It existed naturally in Africa. It still does today. There is TBR in Africa today. It's just a protozoa. It's, a simple animal. um, almost on the same level as a bacteria, if you will. But it had mutated somehow. Dr. Staten in the book says it has a mutated, I think SVG or VSG. I'd have to go back and look because I did the research, 7 years ago. But there really is evidence that those protozoa can mutate if their proteins mutate, if their proteins change, and that's what that is. It's a protein that affects its behavior and its lethality and how it affects, its host, humans being the host, of course. So we'll see more about this, quote unquote, corruption of the government and how the government responds. But it's a very complex issue, and it's kind of an issue that, like I've mentioned, has been mirrored a little bit to a lesser extent in our own lives here in the past few weeks. All right. So the next question, Gabriel asked, why did the guy accept cash from Marlin instead of supplies? As the author, I just wanted to have this very subtle line to show that even though things are kind of crazy in the United States in general, there is some semblance of normalcy. And by accepting money, instead of goods, that means that some people still value currency. And if you value a currency, that means, the situation isn't completely lost, right? Because currency is based on faith that currency is worth something. And so by accepting that, he has faith that the economy or the government or society will continue on. Okay, Cherokee asked, why didn't the United States ask for help from our allies during the outbreak? Marlin mentions this a little bit when he says, Canada closed its borders and Mexico, who technically in 2013 was still our ally, not as much anymore, unfortunately, but the drug lords of Mexico, which unfortunately is kind of a real influence in some parts of the Mexico, especially the northern border. They kind of shut the United States out. We don't really know in this book exactly what happened to Europe, but for various reasons, the U.S. just did not get any help. And unfortunately, I hate using like our real life, and I try not to politicize anything, and stay objective. But we've seen from the federal government the reaction of our leaders to global affairs. And so right now, we are not really a very internationally focused government. Okay. The government that we have currently in Washington, D.C., both Congress and the executive branch are very focused on domestic issues, and we don't really rely for any kind of assistance from the international community. Okay, that's kind of what happens in the book as well, if I had to guess. All right, so Jory asked, why has the CDC gone completely quiet? The CDC, Centers for Disease Control, it's kind of unnerving how similar our current situation is in real life with this book. And again, the book goes to the extreme. But, think about what has the CDC's response been to the coronavirus. They've laid out recommendations and, they've put a few things on websites. But other than that, we don't have any real leaders stepping up saying, look, this is exactly what we need to do. This is what's best for our health, because everything gets filtered through various task forces, and it gets debated by Congress, and then it gets filtered through the executive branch, and then it's all put out as a recommendation instead of as like this directive or this order. And so if something is recommended, that leaves people with the option of not doing it. And so to a certain extent, the CDC has kind of gone silent because the CDC wasn't listened to in the book. And so the Department of Homeland Security, which in 2013 was getting a lot more powerful, it was one of the newer branches of the federal government in terms of like departments, because it was created after September 11th, 2001, whenever we had the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and then the failed attack, we assume, on Washington, D.C. that crashed in Pennsylvania, the plane. But that new DHS, Department of Homeland Security, it was becoming more and more powerful. And so it was kind of like the natural department for me as the author to choose to lead this response. Taking over the CDC, taking over FEMA, taking over all these different authorities, and then using that combined power to work in conjunction with the separate Department of Defense. Okay, so Addison, who is the woman that let him stay in her shack? That was Jenny. And Jenny was this individual from Cedar Lake who apparently was a kind-hearted soul, so almost the opposite of Clara and Kilo. Jada, it said that people were coming to California to help. How exactly can they stop this and end it? What do they have to do? I don't remember writing about California as much as Chicago, but California, New York, I know that they were hard hit, which again, it seems like I'm just repeating what's going on in the world today, and in a way, as the author, I kind of hate that because I don't like thinking about my book as being a reflection of an extreme version of our reality, but California and New York are the two hardest hit states in the United States with our actual pandemic. And so in the book, I said California and New York, the East Coast and West Coast, are the two hardest hit locations in the book. So help is going to be hard to come by in those areas. But Chicago, even though there were some extreme measures taken, it seems like they still have electricity in some parts of the city. There's more or less order in the city. And so that's where that help comes from in the city. Now, what happens after that, we don't really know, but that's kind of where we're at. So the next question is from Brianna. Why did Jenny run into the woods instead of staying and helping? So Jenny, was not a fighter. Jenny was a secretary, and not a knock against secretaries, but she was not a fighter, and was probably very out of place already in that camp. And she probably stayed at that camp because the camp was security for her, is safe for her there, even surrounded by insanity of the rest of the camp. There were no roamer attacks, and so when those roamers breached the fence, there was no need to stay for her. She took her chances and took off. Benjamin asked, my question is the government trying to get people with the sickness that still have control? Maybe they made the sickness and maybe they made it and was supposed to make human weapons and not human savages. Very perceptive of you, Benjamin. We will see what the government's intentions are in January. Chelsea asked, what would you do if Jenny ever betrayed you? Marlon, he was obviously starting to trust Jenny. We don't really see if Jenny betrayed him or not. Jenny ran away, but I don't think Marlon blamed her for that. I think Marlon, in the heat of the moment, probably would have ran if he could, but chose to fight off the roamers because that's what he was used to doing. Jenny was not. And he clearly cared for her because he asked about her once he was safe in the hospital. Okay, so Alicia asked, are Marlon and Dr. Staten in love? Well, yeah, I think so. I think they have this affection for each other, and we'll see how it plays out in January, Alicia. But, it was kind of a strange part to write. One of the questions that has been asked in the past is, why would Marlon just forget about his wife and start thinking about Jenny first, and then think about Dr. Staten next. He mentions how lovely she looks and all these things. Uh, you have to keep in mind that Marlon has gone through a lot of emotional turmoil, and that grieving process is probably accelerated quite a bit. And so, the question really is, how long are you supposed to grieve someone that you love before you can move on? And there's no real answer to that. If all things were normal and, Marlon's wife died, just, died in a car accident or died of an illness or something, would it be acceptable for Marlon to start dating in a year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years? Should he stay widowed, a widower for life? Should he start dating again in 6 months, 3 months? To put a time on it is really difficult to do in reality. But then when you have this Romer attack and all these crazy happenings, you almost live in the moment. And so he grieves for Anne. He grieves that loss. But at the same time, he needs an emotional connection as a human being. And he needs some sort of comfort that he finds in Jenny. And then, he grieves Jenny briefly, didn't know her all that well. That's why Dr. Satan said, did you know her very well? And he's like, no, because he realizes she's as much of a stranger as anybody else. She was just a very kind stranger to him. And so he probably starts falling for Dr. Staten because Dr. Staten is nurturing, which is something he has not felt in a very long time. Okay, that's a good question, Alicia. Okay, so Eric asked, where did the outbreak start originally? You will find that out in January. Iana asked, what is a CPA? CPA is a certified public accountant. So someone that usually does taxes or other kind of legal documents, finance documents, that type of thing. Betsy asked, why did he hit Chuck in the face? So that little section, and again, I was asked before by somebody, maybe not your group of questionings, but as the author, I've been asked before, if I could change anything about the book, what would I change? I would probably spend a little bit more time with details. Going back and looking at December, it seems very rushed because so much happens in November and December and then in January. But what we're seeing is a transition in Marlon. So Marlon gets infected, and all things being equal, Marlon should turn into a roamer, right? But he's treated with this experimental treatment that Dr. Staten has developed along with Dr. Rose, and it keeps him from becoming a monster, if you will, or someone that has no consciousness. And it's supposed to heal him, but instead the protozoa, because it's a living creature, even though it's very small, it still is adaptable. It mutates. It responds to the treatment differently than she expects, like Leo did. Leo was another one of her patients that did not respond as expected, and so now Marlon is changing, but he's changing into not necessarily a roamer, but someone that has some roamer qualities, but still maintains his own consciousness. And so, Chuck in the story is the guard of the hotel, the Princess Casino Hotel. And so, the policy is no weapons. And Marlon, being through all those things that he's been through, is like, I'm not giving up my weapon. Chuck's like, you're going to hand it to me. And Marlon, because he has that tendency of being animalistic, he snaps and he hits Chuck almost as a reflex. He's not focusing on logic anymore. Now he's just going to respond, which like a roamer would just respond to some sort of stimuli. So that's the long answer of why he hit Chuck in the face. Carissa asked, when you were asking about her family and when she said she didn't have any, did you feel bad? If you're referring to Jenny, I don't know if Marlon felt bad so much as Marlon probably had empathy and understanding because he had lost most of his family. So I think it was this connection, this emotional connection that they had. They shared that same feeling. Okay, so Javon asked, "Did you ever wish?" Meaning, did Marlon ever wish he could bury his dad? Yes, and I think that was for him one of the signs that he was losing grip on his humanity. Not just bury his father, but he left him in a parking lot. That's quite a change from. If you remember when his mother died, he burned the body of his mother so that way roamers wouldn't dig her up and eat her. Right? To I left my dad in the parking lot. That's a drastic change in his philosophy of what to do with the dead. Michelle asks, how did the doctors explain to the government that the patient they were going to pick up was missing? So we will see that in January. What happens? Tabitha asks, was Marlon catching feelings for Dr. Staten, or was he, I love the term catching feelings, or was he just reminiscing the memories of Anne? And why are the president of the cabinet and Congress all hiding instead of trying to figure out FEMA's actual intentions? A very thoughtful line of questions there. Okay, so Tabitha, Marlon was catching feelings for Dr. Staten. Absolutely. But part of it was because he had memories of Anne and he was lacking in that human connection. And so, Dr. Staten is giving him this nurturing presence. And so he's drawn to that. She's gentle compared to the savagery he's experienced. And then the other part, by hiding, I guess as the author, I should have explained it a little bit more. But typically, in any kind of disaster, members of Congress, the president, they go to secure locations across the United States because they can then remotely affect leadership. And kind of what's been interesting in this outbreak, I guess, to show that maybe it's not too serious, or maybe they think they can keep a handle on it. But the president and vice president have been next to each other this entire time. And so if one gets sick, then it's likely the other will get sick. And if that happens, if both of them are intubated or whatever, if both of them can no longer carry out their duties, the line of succession for president goes like this. If the president cannot fulfill his duties as president, the 25th Amendment allows for the vice president to assume those duties until the president can tell Congress that he has once again been able to resume his duties. Okay, that's the 25th Amendment. However, if the vice president is also incapacitated, the line of succession says that the Speaker of the House. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. The Speaker of the House then takes over as president temporarily. So, the Speaker of the House is Nancy Pelosi. So that would mean Nancy Pelosi would become our president for a while anyway, until either the president or the vice president could ensure Congress that they were able to resume their duties. So that, for me, has been an interesting thing to watch, just as, a history teacher and, social studies teacher, because that line of succession has never gone to the to the Speaker of the House, let alone after the Speaker of the House, then it goes to the members of the cabinet, Department of Defense, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Secretary of, all the way down to I think the Secretary of the Interior or somebody like that is the last in line of succession of 28 or so people. But so in the book, going back to your question, they were not necessarily hiding because they were scared. They were hiding so that way it lessened the chance that we lost all government. So they probably know what's going on with FEMA. They might even be directing FEMA, or maybe they're all dead and FEMA is in charge. The FEMA, I believe, at this point is under, if I remember in the book, they are under the Department of Homeland Security. So maybe the Department of Homeland Security, that Secretary of Homeland Security, is now in charge of the United States government. We just don't know that from Marlon's perspective. Okay. These are all good questions. Nira asks, does Dr. Staten actually like Marlon, or is she just being nice? Also, if she had gotten caught helping him leave the hospital, would she have gotten killed? So this is something I kind of thought about as the author, because I hesitated to make Dr. Staten and Marlon have this love interest because it's very cliched. Cliche is something that it happens all the time in books or movies, and it's expected. Uh, Man meets woman, woman meets man, they fall in love, even though they probably shouldn't. We've seen it kind of change over time. To show you an example of that, in the movie Frozen, the original movie, not the sequel, but in the original, Anne and Prince Hans, I think it is, they quote unquote fall in love immediately. But in reality, they aren't really in love. And so by the end of the movie, she is now in love with somebody else, but not in love. Like, they don't end up getting married instantaneously like you would see. They are just happy together as friends. And so that's kind of a break in the cliche. But in order for me to move the story forward, I needed Marlon to have an ally. And there's no better ally than someone that cares for you and you care for them, almost like you are in love with them or you love them. And so, really, for this book, I think Dr. Staten and Marlon, they really do love each other for reasons yet unknown, but they do. So it's kind of a strange thing to write as an author. I don't know if that really answers your question, but sure, she loves him. And then the other is, would she have gotten killed? She probably would not have gotten killed, but there would be some serious questions as to why she did that, and she might have been arrested. She might have been, tortured. Who knows? But killed probably not so much, because up until this point, it seems as though the government is keeping an eye on Dr. Staten because they are using her research. Whether she realizes it or not, she is probably a valuable asset to them. Okay, so Kylan, what was the girl doing sitting in the car in the middle of the field? So I'm trying to think back to what that might be referring to. If you are talking about Jenny, or if you were talking about Dr. Rose. So I'd have to go back and look. Jenny, of course, she was being Jenny. She's not a fighter. She's probably just thinking to herself. And then Dr. Rose, she was actually watching the house there for a while. Devin, when the guy put the gun to his face, he said everything turned black and he beat up the man. Also, the government wants to study him. Did he get special abilities with the infection? So, yeah, he did get special abilities with the infection, Devin. If you recall, Dr. Staten says there were side effects to the illness with the treatment that she had seen only one other time. That was with a subject, a patient she called Leo. Now, for me, as the author, I hesitated to actually end the book this way because the book is nearing its conclusion. But, being a first-time writer and wanting to show Marlon in different stages of his own humanity, I wanted to give him the ability to not be human, but at the same time be human. So I couldn't make him like a roamer completely because the whole story is based on his journal. But I did want him to be more than vulnerable like he has been for the rest of the book. So he does get some abilities, but those abilities have some long-term consequences. And, And of course, one of those is the government is after him because they want to study him because he is an exception. And so maybe, somebody asks, were they trying to make a weapon instead of pandemic? Maybe they were trying to create a super soldier. We kind of get a little bit of this in the next chapter, and I don't want to give much away, but there are a lot of questions surrounding why this is a possible outcome. Why superhuman strength and this loss of feeling is a side effect. Okay, Cecilia asked, why are their buildings still open during the pandemic? Has a cure already been made? So, Cecilia, the best explanation is actually taken from our own experience. Most places are closed today in real life, but there are still places open. Hotels are open. A lot of them are empty in most parts of the country, but they are technically open. Grocery stores are open. Hospitals are open. Call them essential workers. Restaurants, they can give curbside service, are open. Now, in the extreme case of this book, fewer and fewer locations would be opened. But, Mattoon, which is where the hotel is, and then East St. Louis, which is where he's at, Marlin is at towards the end of the chapter. And then even in Chicago, where the hospital is, those places were hit by the infection, but not hit as hard. And so life is slowly returning to normal, just like in other parts of our country. Kentucky, we're still more or less ordered to work from home, to stay at home. Healthy at home is our initiative officially. But there are places in the country where things are more or less normal. Now, the risk for infection is still there from the coronavirus, but most businesses are open. There's not really a widespread lockdown in some states. And so, just like today, other parts of the country in the book are not subject to the same kind of lockdown. All right. Okay. Nicholas asks, why did Jenny run into the woods? Why did she not help? Was she scared? Yes, she was scared, and as I said, she was not. She was not a fighter, and so she took off. Fabiola asked, "Can't you maybe steal some motorcycles or like faster cars so the trip doesn't feel so long, and you get a little more sleep?" Yeah, so that's something that, as the author, Fabiola, I kind of thought about a lot. How can I move the story forward and yet still seem very dramatic? How can I show that it's a very difficult situation? So, even though between Chicago and Mattoon, the roads are open, I couldn't just have him driving down there, like it was just a road trip. It had to be somewhat of a struggle, so it would affect Marlon's mental state. Um, and so, I dumped that snow on the road. I think it was 18 inches or something, which is a foot and a half of snow. So, he does have a pretty good car, an '89 Camaro, but that's pretty fast usually. But if you are in 18 inches of snow, Camaro's very low to the ground, not going to go anywhere. So he kind of has to go slow, maybe get stuck a few times. We don't really know. Has to push himself out. Motorcycle, of course, in December, fairly cold traveling. And even though he has those special abilities now where he's starting to lose feeling and has quicker reflexes and things, motorcycle probably not the safest way to travel. But I like your line of thinking. All right. A few more questions here. Maria asked, what do the people work in the CPA? So again, I answered this before, but CPA is just a certified public accountant. Just to show Jenny, just as an office worker, she has no survival experience whatsoever. Maybe she's mechanically inclined because she fixed the truck, but working in a CPA office, you are not prepared to deal with the craziness of Kilo and Clear. I can tell you that. All right. Johanna asked, do Marlon and Dr. Satan love each other? Very common theme. Yes, we'll see that they do, in fact, love each other. They are very affectionate to each other. Whether or not that's good writing or bad writing, it's kind of up for the reader to decide. That's the direction I took as the author. But, it would be very interesting to see it go in a different direction, too. Alejandra asked, if Marlon was to spend one more Christmas with Anne and his parents, how would it be? and what would he change? I think he would be very grateful, that gratitude of being with family. And, I can tell you as the author, I had to put myself into the shoes of Marlon as I wrote. And, I had never really experienced not being with my wife and children or not being with my family whenever I wanted to be. So we would always celebrate Christmases together and Easter together and holidays, birthdays, whatever. We could go visit whenever we wanted to, with my parents or my wife's parents or whatever. But, this pandemic has confirmed a lot of what I think Marlon would have felt, in that we can't just go today to visit people. And, I think whenever we are able to do that again, we will be very grateful, and we will appreciate a lot more the company that we are able to have with our loved ones and our family and our friends once this pandemic clears up enough that we are able to do so. Okay, Alessandra asked, how is he different from most people? So Marlon, of course, we don't really know exactly why he is not cured in the same manner as others, other than it's just that liberty I take as the author. Marlon is the main character. He is the protagonist of the book. So he gets the special abilities that nobody else does, except for apparently one person, Leo. Alexander, if Leo was the patient that the doctor had before, what if Leo was still alive, and how would it be like? So Leo, we don't know if he's still alive. There is the possibility that he is. And originally, whenever I was writing the book, I was going to have Marlon actually meet up with Leo, but I just couldn't get it to work in my vision of how the story should go. Uh, you know, I didn't want to get too far involved in like this huge government thing. Like Marlon turn into some sort of superhero and break into a facility to rescue Leo, or like that's all possible, I suppose. But for this particular book, I wanted to focus just on Marlon. And so while the possibility exists that Leo's still alive, I did not actually pursue it in the book. Okay, so that ends the questions for December. I really have enjoyed reading your questions and trying to think about the rationale behind why I wrote what I did as the author. We've got one chapter to go. That is the chapter on January, and I have those questions. So in my next video, which I'm going to do very soon, I will answer those questions, and that will end the book. So I hope up until this point you have enjoyed it, and I look forward to answering your last set of questions very soon. Till then, take care.